Welcome to Generation Digital Workforce, the podcast that's here to explore the role of robotic process automation and other digital technologies. Whether you're just getting started or you're looking for advanced strategies and tactics, if you're curious about where human and digital workers are coming together to transform the future of work, then this podcast is for you. All right, let's get into the show.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brad Hairston with Blue Prism. Today on the Generation Digital Workforce, I am delighted to have as my guest Mr. Mark Howard, who is based in Denver and is a partner with the global advisory firm Alvarez & Marsal. I will be talking with Mark about the opportunity for the digital workforce in the public sector, which is Mark's area of focus. Mark, thank you for joining me today.
A pleasure to be with you, Brad. Thanks for the time.
You bet. So why don't you start by just sharing about your career background and tell us about the work you and your colleagues at Alvarez & Marsal perform in the public sector.
Appreciate it very much. I've actually spent 35 years in public sector, either as a government executive. I served as a department head, a budget director, a deputy city manager, and a city manager for cities in Texas, Colorado, and Wisconsin. Or I've been an advisor and a consultant to governments around the world. And I've been fortunate enough to work with governments at all levels. And as I mentioned, around the world, and with federal agencies, state governments, local governments, cities, counties, special districts, and in fact, a few agencies of the United Nations. So it's been a very interesting career learning about how public sector works. The kinds of things that Alvarez & Marsal does, that we do in our public sector practice, is really four primary things. At heart, Alvarez & Marsal is a turnaround restructuring firm. So one of the things that we do very well is help manage crises. And from the fact that we can help manage crises, the three things that we can do that are probably the most helpful to governments are that we really focus on driving operational improvements and operational efficiency. We help to improve citizen services, and we really support financial innovation. And all of those are things that over the years, I've learned that governments and public sector entities can definitely gain benefit from the focus that we bring in those areas.
Okay, great. That's really good background. Thank you. So, Mark, it's well known that the area of robotic process automation, which we at Blue Prism nowadays we tend to call it more the digital workforce, it emerged around 15 years ago in the private sector, specifically in banking and insurance companies. When did the public sector get involved in the action and start taking advantage of this capability to drive efficiencies?
That's always an interesting question, because one of the things that I think is really important to understand is, by design, public sector can't do a lot of experimentation. So as a result, because there's not a great tolerance for experimentation using public money. So by design, public sector generally runs anywhere from 5 to 10 years behind the innovations that you'll typically see in private sector. And as you mentioned, private sector really started ramping up with RPA about 15 years ago. And right on cue, I'd say it's about 5 to 7 years that that public sector has really started saying, okay, this looks real. It looks like there's a real return on investment here. It looks like it's a safe thing for us to use public dollars on. So I'd say it's, certainly the clients that I'm working with, I started talking about RPA with them probably 7 years ago. And in the last 4 to 5 years, I've started seeing more proofs of concept and have started actually seeing a few programs, full programs across parts of governments. It's a slow start, but it's probably been about the last 5 to 7 years.
So from your perspective, what is the maturity level today of the public sector in terms of using digital workers, to handle repetitive, business rule driven, high volume business processes?
I would have answered that question differently 2 months ago before the pandemic crisis, but I'll give the answer in two parts. As of 2 months ago, my answer would be, and to some extent still is, the maturity level is very early, very young. There's still, as I mentioned, there's a couple of really promising programs across an entire government that I'm aware of that are underway. But for the most part, it's really proof of concept. It's small uses of robotic process automation for a few processes. People are sort of sticking their toe in the water. So I would say in the very young stages. The caveat to that is with the pandemic crisis, I've actually started having a number of conversations with a lot of people saying, a lot of clients saying, hey, we think that we're going to need to find a lot more ways to automate because we think an awful lot of our workforce is going to be working remotely for some time to come. So, how might we be able to really operate much more efficiently and make them better able to do their work remotely? I think RPA is going to be a critical component to that need. So I think that the pandemic has definitely ramped up the interest. It hasn't ramped up the maturity, obviously, because it's still brand new, but it's definitely ramped up the interest in the topic.
Okay. So let's have a little bit of a use case discussion. The digital workforce can automate so many different things, within different organizations, whether in the private or the public sector. But I think it would be really good to hear from your perspective, what are some great use cases that government agencies should consider automating? And you can talk, I know at A&M, you guys do work in the federal level, the state level, and even the municipality level. So it would be good to hear some examples maybe across that spectrum.
Well, as you well know, basically any sort of repetitive work that cuts across platforms that a human being has to do, a digital worker can do. And there's so much of that in government. I mean, the use cases, when you really start to spin them out, my experience is that, having done this a couple of times with a number of clients, when you first sit down and say, let's come up with a list of use cases, and you have a blank sheet of paper, they'll initially sort of scratch their heads and go, well, I'm not really sure of anything. And you come up with 10. It's a struggle initially to come up with 10, and then that gets them going. And it is not uncommon in my experience after that first 10 to have a meeting the next day and you've got literally 150. Yeah. So yeah, you can come up with an awful lot of them. It just takes getting people primed and getting them going. So to give you some examples, and again, sort of picking up on the timeliness of today's unfortunate events, unemployment offices are just getting besieged right now. And one of the reasons that people are having trouble applying for unemployment benefits is because there has to be a human being on the line with them right now. That whole process could be handled, or a very large part of the process of taking the name, taking the detailed information, going out and finding their any previous unemployment claims that they may have made, any employment records, tax records, all the things that you have to go through to help somebody apply for unemployment benefits. A digital worker could easily do, if not all of it, a very large part of it, and help handle the the unfortunately very large number of claims that are coming into most state offices at the moment. Similarly, welfare benefits applications of all sorts. It's a very time-consuming process to make sure that you've got all the right information, that you've gathered all of the different pieces of information of what somebody's eligible for, all the supporting records and details, that usually you have to cut across a bunch of different databases, a bunch of different areas to find all the information and gather it together so that you're talking about the person, not about the program. And right now, most benefits offices do that with people. You would much rather do that busy work with a digital worker so that the people can actually talk to the applicant and spend more of their time talking to the applicant and making sure that they're getting what they need, and giving that personal touch. Another area that's one of my, I've spent time working with child welfare offices, and seen some of the tragic situations that caseworkers have to deal with, and the caseloads that they have to deal with are just enormous. And part of it's mind-numbing work, because when they get a case, you have to go and gather information about the child, about the family, prior incidents, and things about where the child goes to school. How there's a ton of information that you have to gather, and again, that takes a lot of time for people to do, and a very large part of that could be automated. That's dealing with and having a digital worker. I bring that up because I bring up those three examples because of today's. Those are some of the situations that I'm talking with clients about now. Unfortunately, the classic at the state level is driver's license renewal. How many times have you once every, I don't know, it depends on the state, but once every 4 years, typically, you have to go in and get a driver's license renewed. And literally all you have to do in many cases is just have an eye exam. And you end up spending half a day sitting around in the office. And in fact, I live in Colorado. I don't even have to have an eye exam. And I end up spending a couple of hours sitting around in the office. I could do all that with a digital worker. I don't need to necessarily wait for a person to do that. In a university setting, just a couple of classic examples: class registration. To some extent, the class registration process, which will, to a very large extent now, that's been automated, but the whole process is there's still a reconciliation that's typically done. But the whole process of what's the current availability, give me background on the classes. A digital worker can really help somebody through that entire class registration process and make it much more efficient. Room reservations, when in a commons area at a university setting where different groups want to use meeting rooms. It's really sort of amazing how often that's not an automated process, and you have to go find the person that manages the reservations for a meeting room. That there's no reason that couldn't be. A digital worker couldn't handle that. In a city setting, things like asking for a special trash pickup could be completely handled by a digital worker. You wouldn't have to call into the office and get a person to schedule a time for a special trash pickup. If you need to make utility service connections, again, can be completely handled by a digital worker. And by the way, and as you well know, Brad, digital workers aren't just an online form. You can actually have set up a digital worker that can converse with a citizen. So this can still feel like you've actually talked to somebody. rather than I submitted a form and I don't know what, it can have a little bit more of a personal touch with these kinds of things. You can also use digital workers if you need to. In the town that I live in, we have internet. The city provides our internet service, and occasionally, once or twice, it's gone out. The city is then trying to scramble to notify people that the service is out. What are the current plans? A digital worker could send a text to everybody, and keeping track of who's lost the service and send a text to let you know what the status is. Public safety could issue safety alerts. Again, via you could use a digital worker to identify cell phones, for example, that are in an area that a crime has been committed. And you want to notify people that, hey, we have a problem in the area, or we have a child abduction, the broad right now, and target your Amber Alerts, for example, to a little bit more focused area where you might know, rather than right now they go up very, very broadly. So those are some of the examples, but there is no shortage, as I mentioned. Let me just also add a few personal favorites in back office processing. Things like preparing all of the information, pulling together all the information you typically need to do for audits. Again, typically takes hours of human staff. It's usually a standard checklist of things to do an audit. There's nothing saying that a digital worker can't do that and pull all of that information together. Performing some of the routine functions like changing addresses when somebody needs to change their address, or they're on their benefits. An employee needs to change their address on their benefits, or they need to add after the birth of a new child. They need to go through the pain of adding them to all of their benefits packages. A digital worker can help them take care of all that. There's a ton of in the sort of finance, routine finance, accounting, purchasing functions that you can come up with a lot of routine work examples in that area. And I'd better stop because I can go on and on, but I will stop at that.
You know what? You could have stopped at driver's license renewals. You really had me at that one. I recently went through that in Texas, and here it's a full day affair. You literally have to take a whole day off from work, just to go stand in line and whatever. So there's hope. There's hope.
That sort of thing just drives me crazy when I see that happening. And I see governments providing that kind of service. It's not because people, it's not because the workers aren't trying. They're doing everything they can. There's just not enough of them.
Right.
And the process is cumbersome. So let's at least use a digital worker to do that, because it is a routine process. And that's just the kind of thing that when I see that and hear that, I'm sorry, that's the situation that you're facing. But whenever I see that, it just drives me crazy.
So Mark, how does Alvarez & Marsal help a government agency take the first steps toward a digital workforce?
So I actually mentioned earlier what that first step typically is. And actually there's a step before that that's a very typical one as well, which is to really say, particularly if the whole concept of a digital workforce is brand new, is to say, let's just start with a very simple proof of concept. Let's talk about one business area, one process, and let's basically set up a proof of concept with a digital worker to do that. And typically that proof of concept only takes about 2 weeks. I mean, we're not talking a big investment of time and energy. And for example, I've done proofs of concept with chatbots that basically provided routine assistance on questions for how do I use this particular system. This was one of them was a financial system, so it was directed at employees. One was an HR system. I've done proof of concepts to say, how do we actually, I mentioned audits earlier, did a proof of concept to set up a robot that would actually help the auditors get all of the information they need. I've done proofs of concept, a couple of them where we did matching of requisitions to procurements to invoices to make sure that everything was legit and to minimize the chances of fraud. I typically recommend proofs of concept in the back office so that the citizens aren't necessarily being exposed to in case something doesn't go well. I haven't had things not go well. I just want to avoid that risk. So we typically start with a very simple proof of concept so that people can actually see what the potential might be. Then we'll typically sit down with the people that are doing the work I mentioned child welfare offices, in an unemployment office, in a finance department, in an HR department. Find the people that are doing the work, show them the results of the proof of concept, what the art of the possible is, if you will. And then just start brainstorming with them. What else could you use this kind of capability for? And as I mentioned, it usually starts slowly. And they'll kind of scratch their heads and they'll come up with about 5 to 10 in the first 45 minutes. And then you say, okay, let's take a break. Let's come back the next day. And it's almost always stunning that once people have slept on it, they'll suddenly come back and go, oh, wait a minute, I came up with all kinds of ideas. And then you'll have a list of, I've had in one auditor's office, we had a list of 200 different processes the next day. And then it's a process of going through and taking each of those and saying, which ones because you can't do all of them all at once. So which ones are your priorities? Which ones are are taking the most time, are going to provide the most, are going to free up people with, how hard are they going to be to actually set up? And so you go through a process of taking a number of criteria, evaluating the processes against that criteria and prioritizing them. And then you basically, not to be overly simplistic, but you start at the top and start knocking them off. Start designing them, it is a bit overly simplistic because there's a fair amount of technical architecture to figure out. But I don't want to make this sound like it's overly complicated. The whole thing that I talked about, usually until you start your actual work to production, that process is measured in weeks. And then the actual implementation depends on the number of, and it's measured in, I'm going to say, 6 weeks, roughly. And then the actual implementation is usually of not the full set of 200 that I mentioned, but a good list of them is measured in months. So you can get some impact. And that's the kind of thing that we really help our clients do, and and roughly how long it takes. It's not a monster program to undertake.
Great. Okay, well, Mark, I'd like to end with this question. Why are you personally motivated to help the public sector make big strides in digital transformation?
I mentioned that I've been working in public sector for 35 years, and it is a labor of love. I personally, this is going to sound sort of corny, but I personally do believe that public service is an honorable profession, and that we all are We're all in this together. The pandemic has only really sort of driven that home even more, and we need to help each other. It starts with the fact that I personally am committed to making public sector better. So when I start with that's really what I've dedicated my whole career to, I then am right now looking at the condition of public sector services. And we barely came out of we just caught up in terms of the funding levels that we have with where we were at the beginning of the Great Recession. And now with the pandemic, we're clearly government funding is dropping off the table. We have no choice if we're going to continue to be able to help each other effectively through public service, other than to find ways for these routine activities that have to be done, to get them done with digital workers so that the human workers can focus on serving citizens, and can focus on providing that human touch that we all need, and that makes government as effective as it can be.
Great way to end. Mark, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights with me today. I truly appreciate it, and we'll talk very soon.
Thank you very much, Brad. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Generation Digital Workforce. If you want to hear more about RPA, AI, and other cognitive technologies that are shaping the future of work, join us next time as we continue to go deeper on these topics with industry innovators and experts. To make sure you never miss a future episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. And if you've liked what you heard today, please leave us a review. It's one of the best ways to help more people find valuable content. For show notes and more info, visit us at blueprism.com/podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.